Jessica almost missed it because she was loading the dishwasher. Years later, that was still the detail she remembered. Not what her husband said, not the affair, not even the moment her marriage fell apart. The dishwasher, the soft clink of a plate against another plate when she heard Victor laughing in the living room. At first, she paid no attention. It was after 10 on a Thursday night. Victor had been at some company celebration downtown. He was supposed to come home, complain about coworkers, drink water, and go to bed. Instead, he came through the front door, laughing so hard she could hear him from the kitchen, still on speakerphone, still talking to coworkers, still acting like the party wasn't over. Jessica rolled her eyes and reached for another plate. Then she heard her own name. That made her pause, only for a second. Then she heard a woman's name, Madison, and suddenly she wasn't loading dishes anymore. She was listening. The men on the phone were laughing about something. Victor sounded proud, too proud. One coworker asked a question she couldn't quite hear. Victor answered immediately, "Nothing." More laughter. Then another voice, "What happens when your wife finds out?" Jessica stepped toward the kitchen doorway. Victor laughed again. "She'll cry." The men laughed. "Then she'll scream." More laughter. "Then she'll forgive me." Jessica felt her grip tighten around the plate. The room suddenly felt different, smaller. Then Victor delivered the line that would stay with her for years. "She doesn't have the guts to leave." The men laughed harder. Jessica didn't, because standing there in the hallway, listening to the man she'd trusted for nearly a decade talk about her like she'd already been figured out, she realized something strange. The worst part wasn't that he was cheating. It was how certain he sounded. And before this story was over, Jessica was going to discover that the affair wasn't even the biggest secret her husband was hiding. Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from and subscribe to officially join the family. If someone had asked Jessica back then whether she trusted Victor, she would have answered without hesitation, yes. Not because their marriage was perfect. It wasn't. They argued about money sometimes. They got irritated with each other over stupid things. There were weeks when work schedules made them feel more like roommates than spouses. But trust had never felt like the problem. That was why what happened later felt so disorienting. Jessica was 32. Victor was 38. They had been married almost 8 years and lived in Charlotte in a neighborhood full of young professionals who were all chasing the same things. Bigger houses, better jobs, better titles. People spent weekends pretending they weren't stressed while quietly comparing careers and salaries. Victor fit perfectly into that world. He worked for a commercial real estate firm and had spent years climbing toward management. At first, Jessica admired that ambition. It was one of the things she loved about him. He had goals, direction, drive. The problem was that over time those qualities expanded until they crowded everything else out. Every conversation eventually returned to work. Every success became a stepping stone toward another success. Every achievement immediately became old news because he was already focused on the next one. The shift happened slowly, too slowly to notice while it was happening. Victor stopped asking questions, stopped remembering details, stopped paying attention to things that didn't affect his goals. One afternoon, Jessica cut nearly 10 inches off her hair. Victor didn't notice. 3 days later, someone else pointed it out during dinner with friends. Only then did he look confused. "Wait, you cut your hair?" Everyone laughed. Jessica laughed too. At the time, it felt harmless. Looking back, it felt different. Not because of the haircut, because it represented something larger. The truth was that life had become crowded. Jessica's mother had been dealing with ongoing health problems. Hospital visits became normal. Work became more demanding. Most evenings she felt exhausted before dinner. When Victor started changing, she found explanations for everything. New clothes, midlife confidence, expensive watches, questionable spending habits, longer work hours, promotion pressure, more gym time, trying to stay healthy. Whenever she asked questions, Victor always seemed to have reasonable answers. And when you trust someone, reasonable answers are usually enough. That was the trap. Trust doesn't always make people safer. Sometimes it makes them easier to fool. By the time Victor began preparing for the promotion that would eventually change everything, Jessica still believed she knew exactly who she was married to. She had no idea how wrong she was. The night everything changed started like any other Thursday. Victor's company was hosting a major celebration at a luxury hotel uptown. There had been rumors about promotions for weeks. Victor talked about little else. When he left that morning, he was wearing a new suit that cost more than their first month's rent together. Jessica remembered teasing him. "You look like you're running for office." Victor smirked. "You'll thank me when we're rich." She laughed. Victor didn't. Then he left. The rest of the day passed quietly. Work, groceries, dinner, normal life. By 10 o'clock that night, Jessica was loading dishes when she heard Victor's truck pull into the driveway. Hard. A few seconds later, the front door slammed. She knew immediately he'd been drinking. Not because he stumbled, because he got loud. Victor always got loud when he drank. He walked through the living room, carrying his phone. Still connected to a speakerphone conversation, several male voices overlapped. Apparently the celebration had continued after the official event ended. Jessica kept loading dishes. Then she heard Madison's name. Everything after that happened quickly. A co-worker laughed. "Dude, she's gonna find out eventually." Victor scoffed. "No, she won't." Jessica stopped moving. Another voice. "No way you've kept that going that long." Victor laughed. "Almost a year." The room seemed to tilt slightly. A year. Then came the sentence. A whole year, and Jessica hasn't suspected a thing. For a moment, Jessica couldn't process it, not because she didn't understand the words, because she understood them immediately. The men laughed. Victor laughed with them, and that was somehow worse. One coworker asked what would happen if she found out. Victor answered without hesitation, "She'll cry." Laughter. Then she'll scream. More laughter. Then she'll forgive me. The confidence in his voice was impossible to miss. Then came the line that hurt most. "And then she'll stay." The men laughed again. Someone asked why he was so sure. Victor didn't even pause. "Because she needs me." Jessica stared at the edge of the counter. Every year of their marriage seemed to compress into a single moment. Then the conversation shifted. Money, trips, hotels, jewelry, expenses. One coworker joked about how expensive affairs must be. Victor laughed. "Joint account, baby." The men reacted immediately. Some laughed. One sounded uncomfortable. Victor kept talking, listing purchases, weekend trips, restaurants, money, their money. Then came the final blow. "Honestly?" The group quieted. "She'll never leave." A pause. Then, "She doesn't have the guts." The conversation continued. Jessica didn't hear another word. A few minutes later, Victor passed out on the couch, still wearing his suit, still smelling like expensive whiskey. Jessica stood in the hallway looking at him. Most people imagine moments like that ending with screaming or crying or confrontation. Jessica expected one of those reactions too. Instead, she felt calm, not peaceful, not forgiving, focused, because something had become very clear. Victor thought he already knew what she would do. That confidence was his blind spot. The next morning, she made breakfast, eggs, toast, coffee. Victor looked miserable. He rubbed his forehead and sat down. "Rough night?" Jessica asked. "You have no idea." She poured coffee. Victor studied her face. "You okay?" Jessica smiled. "Why wouldn't I be?" For a second, he looked uncertain. Then he relaxed. The relief was immediate and revealing. Before leaving for work, he kissed her cheek. "Love you." Jessica smiled again. "Have a good day." Then she watched him drive away. The moment his truck disappeared down the street, she went upstairs, opened her laptop, and logged into their financial accounts. At first, nothing looked unusual. Bills, mortgage payments, utilities, normal expenses. Then she started looking closer. $300, $500, $900, charges hidden inside ordinary life, travel expenses, client dinners, business trips, things she would have ignored a week earlier. Now she didn't. The deeper she looked, the worse things became. By midnight, she had identified thousands of dollars she couldn't explain. By 2 in the morning, she had discovered a pattern. And by the time she finally pushed away from the desk, one unsettling truth had become impossible to ignore. The affair was real, but it wasn't the whole story, not even close. And somewhere inside years of financial records, hotel receipts, and hidden transactions, Jessica had the growing feeling that she was about to discover who Victor really was. For the first time in their marriage, she wasn't looking at the man she loved. She was looking at the evidence. The first thing Jessica discovered wasn't another woman. It wasn't hidden messages. It wasn't even the missing money. It was herself. The realization arrived unexpectedly a few days after she started digging through financial records. She was sitting in her car outside a grocery store when she noticed a name in her contacts. Tasha. They used to talk constantly. College friends, the kind who could spend 3 hours together and somehow leave with more stories than they arrived with. Jessica couldn't remember the last time they'd had an actual conversation, not a text, not a birthday message, a real conversation. On impulse, she called. Tasha answered on the second ring. There was a brief pause. Then, Jessica. The surprise in her voice stung more than Jessica expected. Oh my God. Tasha laughed. You're alive. Jessica smiled, despite herself. Barely. Well, now I feel neglected. The conversation was easy. At first, work, family, life updates, the safe topics people use when they're trying to bridge years of distance. A few days later, they met for coffee. The awkwardness disappeared quickly. The friendship hadn't died. It had simply been neglected. Eventually, Tasha leaned back in her chair, studied Jessica for a second, then asked, "Can I say something?" Jessica nodded. "Sure." Tasha hesitated. "Promise you won't get defensive." Jessica laughed. "That's never a good sign." "I'm serious." "Okay." Tasha looked down at her coffee, then back up. "I don't think Victor ever liked sharing you." Jessica blinked. "What does that mean?" "I don't mean anything weird." Tasha shook her head. "I'm not saying he controlled you." "Then what are you saying?" Tasha searched for the right words. "You disappeared." The statement hung there. Jessica immediately started forming a response, then stopped because she wasn't sure it was wrong. Tasha continued carefully. "You stopped coming to things. You got busy. So did everybody else." Jessica looked away. The conversation wasn't accusatory. That somehow made it harder. "I don't know," Jessica said quietly. "I think life just happened." "Maybe." Tasha nodded. "Or maybe his life happened." Jessica didn't answer because suddenly memories started surfacing. Weekend trips canceled because Victor had work. Dinner plans moved around Victor's schedule. Friendships that slowly faded because maintaining them became inconvenient, not impossible. Inconvenient. The distinction mattered. Jessica had spent years adjusting, compromising, accommodating. At the time, it felt normal. Now she wasn't so sure. When they finally left the cafe, Tasha hugged her. "Whatever's going on," she said softly, "don't disappear again." Jessica promised she wouldn't. Driving home, she found herself thinking about that conversation more than the affair, not because it hurt more, because it explained something. The cheating hadn't created all the distance. The distance was already there. The cheating simply forced her to notice it. And once she noticed it, she couldn't stop seeing it. A few nights later, Jessica found Madison, not intentionally, at least not at first. One social media profile led to another, then another. Eventually, she landed on the page of a woman she'd never met, but who had somehow become part of her marriage. Jessica stared at the profile picture. This was the woman Victor had risked everything for. She expected immediate hatred. Instead, she felt confused. Madison looked normal, happy, smart, young, maybe 26, 27, not the villain Jessica had imagined. Jessica spent nearly an hour scrolling photos, restaurants, weekend trips, friends, work events, nothing unusual. Then she started reading captions. And that was where things became interesting. Certain themes appeared repeatedly. Patience, waiting, timing, new beginnings, fresh starts. The language wasn't obvious, but after a while, a picture started forming. Madison seemed to believe she was in a serious relationship, not a secret one. A serious one. Jessica sat back in her chair. Something didn't fit. If Madison knowingly dated married men, she hid it well. There were no jokes, no hints, no smug comments, nothing. Instead, she sounded like someone waiting for a relationship to move forward, waiting for promises to become reality. Jessica opened another post, then another. The more she read, the more uncomfortable she became, because a possibility she hadn't considered was starting to take shape. What if Madison didn't know the truth? The question stayed with her for days, and then she got her answer. The answer arrived on a Tuesday morning. Victor left his phone on the kitchen island while showering. For years, Jessica would have ignored it. Now, she looked immediately. The screen lit up. A message from Madison. "Miss you." A few seconds later, another appeared. "How much longer do we have to keep pretending?" Jessica stared. Then Victor responded from another device, probably his tablet upstairs. "Soon, I promise. I'm almost done handling everything with Jessica." Jessica's stomach tightened. Handling everything, as if she were paperwork, an obstacle, a task. Another message appeared, this one from Madison. "I don't want to hurt anybody. I just want us to be honest." Jessica read it twice, then a third time. The shower continued running upstairs. Victor had no idea she was standing there, no idea his entire second life was slowly falling apart. Jessica put the phone back exactly where she'd found it, then walked away. For a long time, she sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The anger she expected didn't arrive. Something else did. Perspective. Madison wasn't helping Victor betray her. Madison was living inside a different version of the same lie. Victor had told Jessica one story, Madison another, and apparently both stories benefited him. The realization changed the investigation. Until then, Jessica viewed the situation as wife versus mistress. Now she saw something else. A man managing separate realities, different promises, different futures, different versions of himself. The problem with that kind of deception is simple. Eventually those realities collide, and when they do, someone always gets crushed. The strange thing was that Victor seemed confident, completely confident, as if he believed he could keep balancing everything forever. Jessica wasn't so sure anymore, because the more she learned, the more she noticed a pattern. Victor wasn't becoming more careful. He was becoming careless, more confident, more comfortable. And people who think they're smarter than everyone around them usually make the same mistake. They stop looking over their shoulder. That night, as Victor sat on the couch answering work emails and talking about his upcoming promotion, Jessica watched him differently. Not as a husband, not even as a cheater, as a man carrying too many secrets. And she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing. One piece she hadn't found yet. One secret Victor was still hiding. What she didn't know was that she was about to find it much sooner than she expected. For the first few weeks after the affair confession, Victor seemed completely comfortable. That was what made everything easier. He believed he was safe. He believed Jessica knew nothing. He believed his biggest problem was keeping Madison patient. Then something changed. Not suddenly, gradually. The more Jessica learned, the less energy she spent pretending everything was normal. She still played her role. She still smiled when necessary, still asked about work, still listened to stories about promotions and office politics. But she stopped filling the silence, stopped chasing conversations, stopped smoothing over awkward moments. Victor noticed. One evening he came home and found her reading on the couch. Normally he would have walked upstairs after a quick hello. Instead, he stopped. "You doing okay?" Jessica looked up. "Sure." Victor nodded, then stayed there, standing in the middle of the living room, as though he'd forgotten why he'd walked in. Finally he asked, "Work stressing you out?" "A little." He studied her face. Jessica held his gaze. A few seconds later he looked away. The conversation ended, but the questions didn't. Over the following days they appeared more often, randomly, unexpectedly. "You seem tired. You've been quiet. Everything okay with your mom?" Small questions, harmless questions, except Victor wasn't looking for information. He was looking for reassurance. Jessica could tell. The problem was that reassurance never seemed to last. One night they were eating dinner when he suddenly asked, "You still trust me, right?" The question landed so abruptly, that Jessica almost laughed. Instead, she set down her fork. What kind of question is that? Victor shrugged. Nothing. Just wondering. She watched him carefully. No reason I shouldn't. The relief crossed his face immediately, then disappeared, as if he realized he'd reacted too quickly. Jessica changed the subject. Victor followed her lead. But she noticed something after that. He started watching her, not constantly, but enough to make her careful, enough to create tension, because Victor didn't know what she knew, and Jessica didn't know how close he was getting to figuring that out. For the first time since that Thursday night, she realized something important. The investigation wasn't risk-free. If Victor discovered what she was doing, everything would change, and not in her favor. The mistake happened on a Wednesday. Jessica had spent most of the afternoon organizing screenshots and financial records on her laptop. The evidence folder had grown larger than she expected. Bank statements, hotel charges, messages, receipts, dates, patterns, proof. She was so focused that she didn't hear Victor come home early. The sound startled her. A truck door, then footsteps, then the front door opening. Jessica's stomach dropped. Victor wasn't supposed to be home for another hour. Without thinking, she closed the laptop. Too late. Footsteps were already climbing the stairs. Fast. She grabbed the nearest folder and shoved it into a desk drawer. The office door opened. Victor stepped inside. You home? Jessica forced herself to smile. You scared me. Victor looked confused. Why? I thought you had meetings. They canceled. He glanced around the office. Not suspicious, just curious. Still, Jessica felt her pulse hammering. Victor noticed the closed laptop. What were you working on? The question sounded innocent. That made it worse. Jessica shrugged. Budget stuff. Victor laughed. You're the only person I know who voluntarily enjoys spreadsheets. The joke landed, barely. For a second, Jessica thought she was safe. Then Victor looked toward the printer. A stack of papers sat there. One page had slipped halfway onto the floor. Jessica hadn't noticed. Victor stepped toward it. Jessica's entire body tightened. One more step, then another. He bent down, picked up the page, looked at it. For one terrible second, she thought everything was over. Then Victor frowned. Why did we get a warranty renewal notice? Jessica blinked. The paper wasn't evidence. It was junk mail. She nearly laughed from relief. Instead, she rolled her eyes. Because apparently, every appliance in America needs an extended warranty. Victor tossed the paper back onto the desk. A minute later, he was gone. The office door closed behind him. Jessica sat perfectly still, listening to his footsteps disappear downstairs. Only then did she breathe. The close call changed something. Until that moment, the investigation had felt controlled. Now it didn't. Victor wasn't stupid, careless, arrogant, self-absorbed, but not stupid. If she wanted this to end on her terms, she couldn't afford mistakes. That night, she backed up everything, twice, and the following morning, she scheduled another meeting with her lawyer, because the situation was moving faster than she originally thought. Much faster. The biggest twist arrived 3 days later, completely by accident. Jessica wasn't searching for new evidence anymore. She was organizing existing evidence, trying to build a timeline, trying to understand how everything connected. That's when she noticed a name, one she'd never seen before. At first it meant nothing, just another contact, another message thread, another unfamiliar number. Then she looked closer. The dates caught her attention, because they overlapped, not with her marriage, with Madison. Jessica sat down immediately. For the next 2 hours she followed the trail. Messages, travel records, reservations, phone logs, everything pointed toward the same conclusion. At first she thought she was misunderstanding something. Then she hoped she was. Eventually, she couldn't deny it. Victor wasn't cheating on his wife with Madison. Victor was cheating on his wife, while also cheating on Madison. There was another woman, a third woman. Jessica stared at the screen, then leaned back in her chair, then laughed, a short laugh. The kind people make when reality becomes ridiculous, because suddenly everything made sense. The unexplained trips, the missing weekends, the overlapping timelines. the inconsistent stories. Victor wasn't balancing 2 relationships. He was balancing 3, and based on what Jessica could see, none of the women knew about the others. The realization changed the entire story. Until then, she'd viewed the affair as the secret. Now she understood the truth. The affair wasn't the secret. Lying was. Lying had become Victor's way of moving through the world. Whenever reality became inconvenient, he invented a new version, a new promise, a new excuse, a new future. The problem with that approach is simple. Every lie creates another responsibility, and responsibilities eventually collide. Jessica looked at the growing collection of evidence spread across her desk. For the first time, she stopped wondering whether Victor would get caught. That question no longer mattered. A better question had replaced it. How long could someone keep this many lies alive before one of them collapsed? Downstairs, Victor was talking on the phone, laughing, making plans, acting like a man completely in control of his life. Jessica could hear his voice drifting up from the kitchen, confident, relaxed, certain. She listened for a moment, then closed the folder, because, for the first time since that drunken confession, she wasn't looking at a husband having an affair. She was looking at a man standing in the middle of a structure he'd built himself, a structure made entirely of lies, and it was beginning to sway. The only question now was what would happen when it finally started falling. Victor got the promotion on a Tuesday. Jessica found out before he told her. One of Tasha's cousins worked at the same company. The text message arrived that afternoon. He got it. That was all it said. Jessica stared at the screen for a moment, then set her phone down and went back to work. A few hours later, she heard Victor's truck pull into the driveway. The front door opened, closed, then opened again. Apparently, he'd forgotten something in the truck. That alone told her how excited he was. When he finally walked into the kitchen, he looked 10 years younger. Not physically, emotionally, like someone who'd spent years chasing a finish line and had finally crossed it. We did it. Jessica looked up from the counter. What happened? His grin widened. The promotion. For a second, she saw the version of Victor she'd fallen in love with years ago. Ambitious, driven, hopeful, not arrogant, not performing, just happy. The sight caught her off guard, because it reminded her that people aren't usually one thing. Even now, even after everything, parts of the old Victor still existed. They were simply buried underneath everything else. He wrapped his arms around her. I knew it. You worked hard for it. I know, he laughed, then immediately looked embarrassed. Sorry, that sounded awful. A little. Victor laughed again. The moment felt surprisingly normal. Then he pulled away. I knew you'd be proud of me. Jessica held his gaze. Congratulations. He accepted the answer without noticing what she hadn't said. The rest of the evening became a celebration. Phone calls, messages, family, friends, co-workers. Everybody seemed happy. And why wouldn't they be? Victor had achieved exactly what he'd been chasing for years. The problem was that success seemed to remove the last remaining filter he had. Over the following weeks, the confidence grew, then expanded, then hardened into something else. Meetings became stories. Stories became bragging. Achievements became proof. Proof that he was right. Proof that he was smarter. Proof that people should listen to him. Jessica noticed the shift almost immediately. Victor didn't. Success has a way of disguising arrogance as confidence, and Victor was drinking deeply from both. Meanwhile, the rest of his life was becoming harder to manage. He simply hadn't noticed yet. The first crack appeared on a Friday night. Victor came home irritated, not drunk, not angry, frustrated. Jessica was reading on the couch when he dropped his keys onto the kitchen counter. Hard. She looked up. Everything okay? Victor loosened his tie. People are exhausting. That usually meant work. What happened? He walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, closed it again. The same thing that always happens. What? Everybody wants something. Jessica watched him. There was more truth in that statement than Victor realized. A few minutes later, his phone rang. The change happened instantly. His shoulders relaxed. His voice softened. Madison. Jessica didn't need to see the screen. She already knew. Victor walked outside to take the call. 40 minutes later, he came back inside looking worse than before, not happier, not relieved, tired. The affair wasn't exciting anymore. It had become work. Madison wanted timelines, commitments, answers, things Victor couldn't give without destroying something else. Over the next few weeks, the pressure increased. Madison became less patient. The third woman became more demanding. Work responsibilities multiplied. Financial problems continued growing. And underneath everything sat one unavoidable truth. Victor had created more promises than he could keep. Jessica could see it. Victor could feel it. Neither of them talked about it. Then another problem appeared. The office. The warning came through Tasha's cousin. Indirectly, the way information usually travels. Apparently, more people knew about Victor's behavior than he'd realized. Not details, not everything, but enough. Happy hour conversations, jokes, comments, people covering for him, people pretending not to notice, people growing uncomfortable. Jessica listened carefully. The affair wasn't public, but it wasn't hidden either. That distinction mattered, because secrets only stay safe when very few people know them. Victor's secret had started spreading, and once enough people know something, eventually it reaches the wrong person, or the right one, depending on how you look at it. The information bothered Jessica, not because she felt embarrassed, because it revealed something important. Victor believed he controlled the story. He didn't. Pieces of the story were already floating around without him. Co-workers had pieces. Madison had pieces. The third woman had pieces. Jessica had pieces. Sooner or later, those pieces would find each other, and when they did, Victor wouldn't be able to stop it. The promotion party was scheduled for late September. Victor talked about it constantly. Guest lists, seating charts, speeches, executives, networking opportunities. Every day seemed to bring a new detail. Jessica listened, nodded, played her role. Meanwhile, her actual life looked very different. The lawyer moved quickly. Accounts were protected. Financial records secured. Documents copied and backed up. Everything important existed in multiple places. Every completed step made Jessica feel slightly lighter, not happier, safer. One afternoon, she stood inside a small apartment she'd recently leased. The rooms were mostly empty, fresh paint, bare walls, a quiet beginning. She walked from room to room, imagining furniture that wasn't there yet, imagining a life that didn't revolve around managing Victor's decisions. The thought felt unfamiliar, but not impossible anymore. As the party approached, Victor became increasingly restless. Jessica noticed immediately. He wasn't suspicious, not exactly. It felt more like anxiety, like someone hearing a noise in another room and not knowing where it was coming from. The conversation happened 2 evenings before the event. They were sitting on the back patio watching the sunset. For several minutes, neither spoke. Victor finally broke the silence. "You've been quiet lately." Jessica smiled. "So have you." He laughed. "No, I haven't." "Fair." The silence returned. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Then he asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." He hesitated, actually hesitated, which almost never happened. "Are we okay?" Jessica looked at him carefully. The question sounded simple. It wasn't. For the first time in months, she saw something she'd never expected. Fear. Not guilt. Not shame. Fear. Victor stared toward the backyard, waiting. Jessica considered her answer. "Why wouldn't we be?" Victor nodded slowly, but the answer didn't help. She could see it. He sat there for another few seconds, then shook his head. "I don't know." The honesty surprised her, because it was real. Maybe the first truly honest thing he'd said in a very long time. Neither spoke. Eventually, Victor stood. "Forget it." Then he walked inside. Jessica remained on the patio, watching the last sunlight disappear, listening to distant traffic, thinking not about revenge, not about exposure, about endings, because she finally understood something. Victor wasn't afraid of losing her. Not entirely. He was afraid of losing control. Control of the story, control of people's perception, control of the version of himself he'd spent years creating. And somewhere deep down, he could feel that control slipping. The The week of the promotion party arrived. Everything appeared normal. Victor obsessed over his speech, checked schedules, adjusted plans, focused entirely on the celebration ahead. 2 days before the event, Jessica organized the final pieces of evidence, the final records, the final timelines, the final documentation. Then she found one last confirmation connecting several pieces together, a detail that removed any remaining doubt. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed the folder. 48 hours. That was all that remained. Downstairs, Victor was on another phone call, talking about the biggest night of his career, talking about the future, talking about everything that came next. Jessica listened to his voice drifting through the house, confident, certain, completely unaware. For months, she'd been asking herself how this story would end. Now she knew, not every detail, not every consequence, but the ending itself. Victor thought he was preparing for a celebration. What he didn't realize was that every version of his life was moving toward the same place at the same time. And in 48 hours, those worlds were finally going to collide. The morning of the promotion party started exactly the way Jessica expected. Victor was talking before he'd finished his first cup of coffee, about attendance, about executives, about future opportunities, about what this promotion might mean 5 years from now. Jessica listened while wiping down the kitchen counter. Every now and then, she nodded, asked a question, played her role, the same role she'd been playing for months. At one point, Victor looked up and smiled, a genuine smile. "You know, none of this would have happened without you." Jessica paused. The comment caught her off guard, not because it was kind, because it arrived so late. "That's nice of you to say." "I mean it." He leaned back in his chair. "We make a good team." Jessica held his gaze. For a brief moment, she wondered if he believed that, if somewhere inside all the lies, he'd convinced himself that parts of his story were still true. Then his phone vibrated. He checked the screen, and the moment disappeared. A few hours later, they left separately. Victor had meetings before the event. Jessica told him she'd meet him there. By sunset, the hotel ballroom was full. The room looked exactly the way Victor would have wanted. Elegant, expensive, impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. Soft lighting reflected off polished glass. Servers moved between groups carrying drinks. Laughter drifted across the room. Success had a look, and this room was designed to display it. Jessica arrived early, not because she wanted to socialize, because she wanted to observe. She spent the first hour watching people interact with Victor. Coworkers, executives, mentors, friends, family. Everywhere he went, people smiled, shook his hand, congratulated him, and watching it was strangely painful, not because they were wrong, because they weren't. Victor could be charismatic, funny, generous, ambitious. People weren't foolish for liking him. They simply didn't know all of him. Around 8 o'clock, Jessica noticed Madison. The recognition was immediate. She'd spent enough time studying photos to know exactly who she was looking at. Madison stood near the bar speaking with another woman. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, Jessica looked closer. The woman beside her wasn't familiar, until she was... Jessica felt her stomach tighten. The third woman. She'd never met either of them, but she'd seen enough photographs to recognize both. For a moment, she wondered if she was imagining things. Then she watched the two women continue talking. Neither appeared uncomfortable. Neither appeared suspicious, which meant neither knew. Yet, Jessica glanced across the ballroom. Victor hadn't seen them. He was standing near a group of executives, laughing at something one of them had said, completely unaware that two different parts of his life were standing less than 30 feet apart. The collision had already begun. Victor simply hadn't noticed. The first sign came during dinner. Madison saw Victor. The smile that crossed her face lasted less than 2 seconds, because immediately afterward, she noticed something strange. Victor's reaction, not happiness, panic, tiny, brief, but there, Jessica saw it happen. So did Madison. Victor recovered quickly, too quickly. He walked over, said something, introduced people, laughed, performed, the same way he always did. For a few minutes it worked. Then the questions started. Small questions, harmless questions. Questions that only became dangerous when combined with other questions. Jessica wasn't close enough to hear every word, but she didn't need to be. She could read body language. Confusion, recognition, concern. Victor moved from one conversation to another with increasing speed, trying to manage information, trying to stay ahead of it, trying to keep different realities separated. The problem was that they weren't separated anymore. At some point, Madison and the other woman ended up speaking without Victor present. Jessica watched from across the room. At first they seemed relaxed, then one of them frowned. A few moments later, the other crossed her arms. The conversation continued. Neither woman looked comfortable now. Victor noticed. The color drained from his face. He started moving toward them. Too late. Much too late. The damage had already started. The women compared timelines, trips, dates, promises, stories, the same promises, the same future. Jessica watched realization spread across both faces. One piece at a time. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no scene. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there was something worse. Recognition, the kind that arrives when a puzzle suddenly makes sense. Madison looked across the room, straight at Victor. The expression on her face was devastating. Not anger, not yet. Disappointment, the kind that comes from discovering someone isn't who they claimed to be. Victor finally reached them. Jessica couldn't hear the conversation, only fragments. What is she talking about? Then, Victor, then, no, then, answer me. People nearby started noticing. Conversation slowed. Attention shifted. Coworkers exchanged looks. A few already knew enough pieces to understand what they were seeing. Others started asking questions. The situation spread the way situations always spread. Person to person, table to table, conversation to conversation. Victor tried to explain. That was probably his biggest mistake, because every explanation created another contradiction. Every contradiction created another question. Soon people weren't discussing a misunderstanding. They were discussing a pattern. Madison walked away first. The third woman followed shortly afterward. Victor tried to stop them. Neither stopped. For the first time all evening, he looked lost, not embarrassed, lost. Because something had happened that he never anticipated. Reality had stopped cooperating. For years he'd controlled information, controlled perception, controlled the story. Now the story belonged to everyone else. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get it back. The rest of the evening unraveled quickly. Co-workers talked. Executives noticed. Questions surfaced about expenses, travel, business trips, financial records. Nothing was proven that night. But curiosity had been awakened. And curiosity is dangerous, especially in professional environments. By 11 o'clock, the celebration no longer felt like a celebration. People were leaving. Conversations had changed. The energy had changed. Everything had changed. Victor stood near the center of the ballroom, still trying to fix problems that were multiplying faster than he could reach them. Jessica watched him for a moment. Then she picked up her purse and left. There was nothing else to see. By the time Jessica reached the house, most of the work was already done. The movers had finished earlier that afternoon. The final boxes were gone. The paperwork was ready. The accounts were protected. The next chapter of her life was waiting. She walked through the house one last time. The empty rooms felt strange, not heartbreaking, not comforting, just strange. The living room echoed. The kitchen felt larger. The bedroom barely looked familiar. Jessica paused in the doorway, remembering ordinary things, movie nights, takeout containers, Sunday mornings, arguments about paint colors, the moments nobody photographs, the moments that quietly become a life. That was the part she mourned, not the affair, the waste of what could have been. Eventually, she left an envelope on the kitchen counter, picked up her keys, locked the door, and drove away. Victor arrived home sometime after 2 in the morning. Jessica would learn the details later. Apparently, he walked through the house slowly, room by room, trying to understand what he was seeing, or what he wasn't seeing. The furniture was gone. The closets were empty. The silence was overwhelming. Then he found the envelope, his name written across the front. Inside was a short handwritten note. Victor, You spent a long time believing kindness was weakness. You weren't the first person to make that mistake, but you were the one who taught me how dangerous it can be. You kept waiting for me to become the woman you imagined, the woman who would ignore reality because she was afraid to start over. She never existed. I hope one day you become honest enough to understand what you traded away. Take care of yourself, Jessica. Later, his brother would tell her Victor sat alone in that kitchen for hours, reading the note, then reading it again, as though the ending might change if he looked long enough. But endings don't work that way. The months afterward were difficult, not dramatic. Real, lawyers, paperwork, meetings, financial reviews, consequences. The promotion was suspended. An internal review followed. Some friendships disappeared. Some family relationships fractured. Others survived. Life rearranged itself the way it always does when the truth finally arrives. Jessica moved into her new apartment, reconnected with old friends, built new routines. Healing turned out to be less dramatic than heartbreak. Mostly, it looked like ordinary days, ordinary mornings, ordinary decisions. The gradual realization that her life belonged to her again. Almost a year later, she saw Victor by accident. A bookstore downtown. One ordinary afternoon. They noticed each other at nearly the same time. Both stopped. Victor looked older, not physically. Life older, the kind that doesn't show up in photographs. After a moment, he crossed the street. Slowly, neither seemed sure how to begin. Finally, he spoke. Hey. A brief silence followed. You look good. Jessica smiled politely. So do you. Victor laughed. They both knew that wasn't true. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Victor looked down. I thought I knew you. The words landed differently than she expected. Not because they were profound, because they were honest. Maybe the most honest thing he'd said in years. Jessica didn't answer. Victor nodded slowly. I thought your silence meant you needed me. Traffic moved around them. People walked past. Life continued. I was wrong. Another silence. Then Jessica understood something she'd spent months trying to articulate. The affair wasn't the deepest betrayal. The money wasn't either. The deepest betrayal happened much earlier. The moment Victor stopped being curious about who she actually was. The moment he replaced the real Jessica with a version that was easier to manage, predictable, convenient, safe. Once he believed that version, everything else became possible. The lies, the arrogance, the certainty. Because in his mind, she'd stopped being a person he needed to understand. She'd become an outcome he thought he could predict. Eventually they said goodbye. Nothing dramatic. No reconciliation. No final argument. Just two people standing on a sidewalk. Then, walking in different directions. As Jessica drove home, she found herself thinking about that Thursday night. For a long time, she'd believed it was the night her marriage ended. Looking back, she wasn't sure. Maybe it was simply the night she finally heard the truth. The truth wasn't that Victor had an affair. The truth was that he'd stopped seeing her long before that. And in the end, the silence he mistook for weakness became the thing that changed both of their lives forever. The thing that gave Jessica her freedom, and the thing that forced Victor to finally meet the consequences of becoming a man who thought he already understood everyone around him. He didn't, and that misunderstanding cost him everything. Before you go, I want to know something. What was the moment Victor truly lost you? Was it the affair? Was it spending their savings? Was it lying to Madison too? Or was it that one sentence, she doesn't have the guts to leave? Comment below and let me know the exact moment you stopped feeling sorry for him. And if this story kept you listening all the way to the end, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs the reminder that silence isn't always weakness.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.